The Mafia boss watched his ex-fiancee's hand connect with the pregnant waitress's back, and in the half-second before gravity claimed her, he understood that some betrayals don't announce themselves with words. They arrive with open palms and marble staircases waiting below. But before the fall, there was the confrontation. Marco Valenti stood 15 feet away, afternoon sunlight cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his estate, illuminating the scene like a stage built for tragedy. He'd been walking toward the grand staircase when he heard voices, sharp, feminine, dangerous in their restraint. Lila Monroe gripped the mahogany railing with her left hand, her right cradled protectively beneath the swell of her belly. 8 months pregnant, she stood at the top of the stairs wearing a simple blue dress that had seen better days, the kind waitresses wore when their shifts ended, but dignity remained intact. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, and even from where Marco stood, he could see the exhaustion carved into the delicate lines of her face. She didn't belong in a place like this. That's what made her dangerous to women like Sophia DeLuca. Sophia stood 3 steps below Lila, positioned at an angle that forced the pregnant woman to look down at her. The ex-fiancé wore Chanel, crisp white and navy, the kind of outfit that announced wealth before words could. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her manicured nails drummed against the marble balustrade with rhythmic precision. Have you ever watched someone you care about walk into danger without knowing you're there? Have you ever felt your heart accelerate because you sense violence in the air but can't yet name its shape? Marco felt both as he moved closer, his footsteps silent on the Persian runner that lined the hallway. You think carrying his child makes you special? Sophia's voice carried across the space, cultured and cold. You think it makes you different from the others? Lila's fingers tightened on the railing. I'm not trying to be different. I'm just trying to leave. Leave. Sophia laughed, the sound brittle as breaking glass. You walked into this house. You accepted his protection. You let him touch you, knowing exactly who he was, what he owned, who he belonged to before you arrived with your poverty and your desperation. He didn't belong to you, Lila said quietly. He told me the engagement ended 2 years ago. The air shifted. Marco saw it happen. The micro change in Sophia's posture, the way her spine straightened, the subtle shift of weight from her heels to the balls of her feet. He knew that movement. He'd seen men position themselves the same way before, pulling triggers. The engagement ended, Sophia agreed, ascending 1 step, closing the distance. But history doesn't disappear just because paperwork does. I built a life around the promise of being his wife. Do you understand what that means? The alliances formed, the respect earned, the future planned down to the last detail. Lila took a small step backward, her heel catching the edge of the top stair. That's not my fault. No, Sophia said, climbing another step. But you're convenient. Marco's hand went to his side, muscle memory reaching for the weapon he'd left in his office. His throat tightened around a warning he couldn't yet voice. Too far away, too uncertain of what he was witnessing, too afraid of escalating something that might still resolve itself with words. I don't want to fight with you. Lila's voice cracked at the edges. I just want to go home. Home, Sophia repeated, tasting the word like poison. You mean the apartment he bought you? The one overlooking the park with the nursery already furnished, the security detail stationed outside 24 hours a day? That home? I didn't ask for any of that. But you took it. Sophia reached the top step now, standing level with Lila, close enough that Marco could see the pregnant woman instinctively turn her body to shield her stomach. You took everything while giving nothing in return except the one thing I couldn't. The jealousy in her voice hit Marco like a physical blow. He'd been blind to it, willfully ignorant of how deeply his choices had wounded a woman he'd once promised forever to. But blindness didn't excuse what he saw crystallizing in Sophia's expression, rage mixed with grief mixed with something far more dangerous. Desperation. But Sophia. Marco's voice cut through the tension, finally close enough to intervene. Both women turned to look at him, step away from her. Sophia's eyes met his, and in them he saw the exact moment she made her decision. Her hands moved before he could process the intention behind them, before his feet could carry him the final 10 steps, before the warning in his chest could translate into action. What happens next will break you, and if you want to understand how love and violence destroy everything they touch, you need to see this through to the end. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed a moment where everything changed in an instant. Drop a comment about whether forgiveness is possible after irreversible harm, and subscribe because this story goes places you can't predict. But I promise you'll feel every second of what comes next. Her palms pressed flat against Lila's shoulders, and pushed. The force traveled through Sophia's arms with precision, intentional and absolute. Not a stumble, not an accident. The choice made solid through motion. Lila's feet left the ground. For one impossible moment she hung suspended mid-air, her body tilted forward at an angle that defied physics, that denied reality, that begged the universe to rewind 3 seconds and rewrite the ending. Her mouth opened in a gasp that never became a scream, too shocked, too disbelieving that this was actually happening. Then gravity remembered its job. Marco's shout tore from his chest, raw, primal, the sound of a man watching his world end in real time. He lunged forward, legs pumping, arm outstretched, as if he could somehow cross 15 feet in 0 seconds, as if willpower alone could reverse momentum. Lila hit the third step. Her shoulder struck first, spinning her body sideways. The blue fabric of her dress twisted around her legs as she tumbled, and through it all, through the chaos and the terror and the sickening crack of bone against marble, her arms locked around her stomach in a cage of flesh and determination. Protect the baby. That was the only thought her mind could hold. She rolled down 3 more steps, her hips slamming into the edge of one with enough force to steal her breath. Her head snapped back, dark hair whipping across her face, and somewhere in the house someone screamed. Maybe one of the staff. Maybe Sophia. Maybe the sound came from Lila's own throat and she simply couldn't hear it over the roar of her pulse. Marco took the stairs 3 at a time, nearly falling himself in his desperation to reach her. Behind him, guards materialized from doorways and corridors, men trained to respond to threats, to intercept danger before it manifested. But what good were weapons and reflexes against gravity? Against choices already made? They were seconds too late. Always seconds too late. Lila's body hit the landing halfway down, bounced once with terrible lightness, then continued its descent. Her dress rode up, exposing scraped knees and bleeding shins, but she never released her grip on her belly, never stopped trying to curl inward, to make herself smaller, to create a cocoon of safety in the center of catastrophe. The estate filled with sound, running footsteps, shouted orders, Sophia's voice rising in what might have been horror or might have been triumph. Marco couldn't tell, couldn't process anything except the pregnant woman tumbling down his staircase, away from him. Always away from him, no matter how fast he moved. She reached the bottom in 7 seconds, that stretched across eternity. Her body settled into stillness against the black and white checkered marble of the foyer, limbs arranged at angles that looked wrong, that spoke of damage unseen. Her dress had torn at the shoulder, and blood, bright, arterial red, pooled beneath her left arm where skin had met stone with unforgiving force. The silence that followed felt like suffocation. Marco reached her in the next breath, dropping to his knees so hard the impact sent pain shooting up his thighs. He didn't care, didn't feel it. His hands hovered over her body, terrified to touch, terrified not to, caught between the desperate need to hold her and the fear that moving her would cause more harm. Lila. Her name fell from his lips like a prayer. Lila, look at me. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with shock. Blood trickled from a cut above her eyebrow, and when she tried to speak, her voice came out fractured, barely audible over the commotion erupting around them. Marco? I'm here. He cradled her head with shaking hands, feeling the warm wetness of blood seeping between his fingers. I've got you. You're going to be okay. She blinked slowly, processing his words through layers of trauma. Her lips parted, and for a moment he thought she might agree, might tell him she was fine, that everything would be fine. Instead, her face crumpled. My baby, she whispered. Marco's world stopped, not slowed, not paused, stopped completely, as if someone had reached into the mechanism of reality and ripped out the gears that made time move forward. He stared at her, at the tears spilling down her temples, at the way her hands still locked around her stomach began to tremble. My baby, she repeated, and the words carried the weight of every fear a mother could hold. I can't feel him moving. Behind them, Sophia stood frozen at the top of the staircase, her face drained of colour, both hands pressed against her mouth. Guards surrounded her, but she didn't fight, didn't run. She simply stared at what she'd done, at the broken woman bleeding on the marble below, and the magnitude of her actions settled over her features like ash. Marco ignored her. His entire universe had condensed to the woman in his arms and the terror blazing in her eyes. Call an ambulance, he barked at the nearest guard. Now. The man was already moving, phone to his ear, rapid-fire words Marco didn't bother listening to. Someone pressed a jacket against the wound on Lila's arm. Someone else cleared a path to the front entrance. The estate transformed into controlled chaos, everyone moving with purpose except Marco, who remained kneeling on bloody marble holding the only thing that mattered. Stay with me, he begged, his voice cracking down the middle. Please. Lila, stay with me. She nodded weakly, but her eyes kept drifting closed, her body going slack in increments that felt like death approaching in installments. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with agonizing slowness. Marco held her like she was made of glass already broken, his arms forming a shelter that came too late. Blood soaked through his shirt where her head rested against his chest, warm and thick, a reminder that bodies were fragile things despite how we pretended otherwise. "Don't move her!" someone shouted from across the foyer. He didn't listen. Couldn't. His hand stroked her hair with trembling fingers, pushing the dark strands away from the cut on her forehead. She was so pale. When had all the colour drained from her face? Had it happened during the fall, or was it happening now, slowly, while he watched helpless? "The ambulance is 3 minutes out," a guard reported, kneeling beside them with the first aid kit already open. "Sir, we need to apply pressure to the arm wound." Marco nodded without looking away from Lila's face. Let them do what they needed. He would hold her. That was his job now. The only job that mattered. Above them, Sophia's voice fractured into sobs. I didn't think. Get her out of here, Marco said, his voice flat and cold as Winterstone. Lock her in the east wing. Don't let her leave. Don't let her speak to anyone. 2 guards moved to flank Sophia. She didn't resist when they took her arms, guiding her away from the staircase, away from the scene of her crime. Her designer heels clicked against the marble in an obscene rhythm, each step a metronome counting down to consequences she hadn't considered when her hands made contact with Lila's back. I'm sorry, Sophia called out, her voice breaking. God, I'm so sorry. The door closed behind her, cutting off the apology mid-sentence. Marco didn't care about sorry. Sorry couldn't undo the fall. Sorry couldn't stop the blood. Sorry was a word people used when they wanted forgiveness for things that should never be forgiven. Marco. Lila's voice pulled him back, thin as thread. Is the baby? Can you feel? Don't talk, he said quickly, too quickly, desperation making him sharp. Save your strength. Help is coming. But she needed to know. He could see it in her eyes, the question consuming her from the inside, eating through shock and pain to reach the only thing that truly terrified her. She didn't care about her own injuries, only the life she carried. He placed his hand gently over hers where she still gripped her stomach. They waited together, silent and still, searching for movement that would mean hope. Nothing. The absence felt like drowning. He's okay, Marco lied, because what else could he do? He's strong. Just like his mother. Lila's eyes filled with tears, but through them, impossibly, she smiled. A small, sad curve of her lips that held more weight than any words could carry. You always show up late, she whispered. The statement hit him like a fist to the sternum. She was right. How many times had he been too far away when she needed him? Too caught up in business, in maintaining control, in protecting an empire while failing to protect the one person who actually mattered. I know, he said, throat tight. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. Not your fault. Her hand found his face, fingers cool against his jaw. You can't be everywhere. But he should have been here, should have banned Sophia from the estate the moment Leela moved in, should have seen the jealousy festering, should have recognised the danger before it manifested in violence on a staircase. Should have. Sirens cut through the afternoon air, growing louder as the ambulance approached. Marco heard the screech of tyres on the circular driveway, the slam of doors, the rush of footsteps toward the entrance. Paramedics burst through the front door, equipment in hand, professionalism radiating from their efficient movements. A woman with kind eyes knelt beside Marco, assessing Lila with practiced speed. Sir, I need you to let her go so we can stabilise her. No, sir, I'm not leaving her. The paramedic exchanged a look with her partner, then nodded. Fine, but move back slightly. Give us room to work. Marco shifted just enough to allow access while keeping Lila's hand locked in his. He watched them check her vitals, apply proper pressure to her wounds, carefully position a cervical collar around her neck. They moved with coordinated precision, calling out numbers and medical terms he didn't understand. She's 8 months pregnant, he told them. The baby? She says he's not moving. The male paramedic's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll monitor both of them en route. Is there any history of complications? No. Healthy pregnancy. Regular checkups. Everything was fine until... His voice failed. Until his ex-fiancée pushed her down a flight of stairs. They transferred Lila to a stretcher with careful hands, securing straps across her body. Marco stood beside them, refusing to release her hand, even as they wheeled her toward the door. Sunlight streamed through the entrance, warm and golden and completely at odds with the horror of the moment. "Sir, you'll need to ride up front," the female paramedic said gently. "I'm staying with her. Hospital policy. I don't care about policy." Marco's voice carried the weight of a man who owned half the city and had no patience for bureaucracy. "I'm staying with her." The paramedic looked at her partner again, received a small shrug, and relented. "Get in. Have you ever loved someone so much that watching them suffer felt worse than any physical pain you could endure? Have you ever held someone's hand and prayed to gods you didn't believe in, bargaining with the universe for just one more chance?" That's where Marco lived in this moment, suspended between hope and devastation, clinging to a woman who might be slipping away despite everything he could offer except the one thing she needed: safety. If this story is reminding you why love matters even when it hurts, show me by hitting that like button. Comment below if you believe some mistakes can never be forgiven. And subscribe because what happens next will test every assumption you have about redemption and consequence. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Inside the vehicle, fluorescent lighting illuminated Lila's pale face, made the blood look darker, made everything feel clinical and cold. Marco sat beside the stretcher as the vehicle lurched into motion, sirens wailing their urgent song. Lila's eyes found his through the haze of pain. "Don't let me die," she whispered. "Never," he promised, knowing some promises were made to be kept and others were made because the alternative was unthinkable. The hospital loomed ahead, emergency room entrance visible through the windshield. Medical staff already waited outside, alerted by radio, ready to receive them. The ambulance pulled up to the doors with practiced precision. This was where everything would either shatter completely or somehow, impossibly, hold together. The emergency room erupted into controlled urgency the moment they wheeled Leela through the doors. Nurses converged. Doctors barked orders. Machines beeped and hummed as they transferred her from the ambulance stretcher to a hospital bed. Marco stayed close, a shadow they couldn't shake. His presence tolerated only because no one had the energy to argue with a man whose desperation radiated like heat. They rushed her into a trauma bay, curtains sliding closed behind them. Marco planted himself just outside, close enough to hear fragments of medical jargon that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. Blood pressure dropping. "Get an ultrasound in here. Possible placental abruption." The last phrase made his stomach clench. He didn't need a medical degree to understand that word, abruption. Something separating that shouldn't separate. Something vital coming apart. A doctor emerged 20 minutes later, surgical mask pulled down to reveal a weathered face that had delivered too much bad news to sugarcoat anything. His scrubs bore fresh bloodstains, Lila's blood, and his eyes carried the exhaustion of someone fighting battles he didn't always win. "Mr. Valenti? How is she?" Marco's voice came out rougher than intended. "Alive. Stable for now." The doctor gestured toward a quieter corner of the hallway. "But we need to talk about her injuries." They moved away from the chaos. The doctor leaned against the wall, crossing his arms in a posture that suggested this conversation would require strength from both of them. "She has internal bleeding. Not catastrophic, but significant. 3 fractured ribs, severe bruising across her torso and legs, a moderate concussion. We're managing the pain as best we can given her pregnancy, but our options are limited." "And the baby?" The doctor's pause lasted 2 seconds too long. "The placenta has partially detached from the uterine wall. It's causing reduced blood flow to the fetus. We're monitoring both of them closely, but I'll be honest with you, the next 24 hours are critical." Marco felt the ground tilt beneath him. "What does that mean?" "It means we wait. We watch. We hope her body can stabilize itself." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "She's strong, young, healthy. Those factors work in her favor. But trauma like this, there are no guarantees." "Can I see her once we get her settled in a room?" "She's asking for you." They moved her to the 3rd floor, to a private room with windows overlooking the hospital courtyard where afternoon light filtered through oak trees. Medical equipment surrounded the bed, monitors tracking her heartbeat, the baby's heartbeat, oxygen levels, blood pressure. The machines created a symphony of beeps that Marco would hear in his nightmares for years to come. Lila looked impossibly small against the white sheets. Ivy snaked from her arms, bandages covered the worst of her wounds, and her face still held that terrible pallor that spoke of blood loss and shock. But her eyes were open, alert, fixed on the doorway as if she'd been waiting for him. Marco crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hand. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey yourself." He settled into the chair beside her bed, bringing her knuckles to his lips. "You scared me." "Scared myself." She attempted a smile that didn't quite land. The baby, they told me. I know. But he's still fighting. Still here. Tears slipped down her temples. I should have left earlier. Should have known she'd die. Don't. Marco cut her off gently. This is not your fault. None of this is your fault. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling over them like sediment. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm. Cars passing, people going about their lives, the sun tracking across the sky. Inside this room, time moved differently, measured in heartbeats and contractions that shouldn't be happening yet. Do you remember the first time we spoke? Lila asked suddenly, her voice dreamy with pain medication. Marco smiled despite everything. The diner. You spilled coffee on my suit. You ordered the most complicated breakfast on the menu at 7 in the morning, then complained when it took too long. I was testing you. You were being difficult. But her eyes held warmth now, memory softening the present's sharp edges. I told you if you wanted fast food, there was a drive-through down the street, and I left you a $200 tip. I thought you were showing off. I was. Marco traced circles on the back of her hand with his thumb. You were the first person in 5 years who talked to me like I was just a man. Not a name, not a reputation, just some guy being annoying before his coffee. Lila's expression grew tender. You came back the next morning, ordered the same thing. And the morning after that. And the one after that. He paused. I fell in love with you over scrambled eggs and burnt toast. The toast was not burnt. It absolutely was. She laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at her injuries. Marco immediately leaned forward, concern flooding his features, but she waved him off. I'm okay, just hurts to laugh. Then I'll stop being funny. You were never funny, just persistent. That was true. He'd pursued her with single-minded determination, showing up at that diner every morning until she agreed to dinner. Then dinner became dinners and dinners became late-night conversations, and somewhere in the middle of all that talking, he'd realized she understood him in ways no one else ever had. She saw past the violence and the power to the man underneath, who just wanted something real. I don't regret it, Lila said quietly. Loving you. Even with everything that happened, I don't regret it. Marco's throat tightened. You should. You'd be safe if you'd never met me. Maybe, but I'd also be alone. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. I'd rather have this, even the terrible parts, than never have known you at all. He was about to respond when the door opened. The same doctor from earlier entered, but his expression had changed. The cautious optimism had vanished, replaced by something far more grave. Mr. Valenti, Miss Monroe, we need to run some additional tests. The baby's heart rate is becoming irregular. Lila's hand clenched around Marco's. What does that mean? The doctor moved to check the monitors. His movements precise but urgent. It could mean the placental abruption is worsening. We need to determine if intervention is necessary. Intervention? Marco stood. What kind of intervention? Possibly emergency delivery. But at 32 weeks there are significant risks to consider. I don't care about risks, Lila interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been since the fall. Save my baby. Whatever it takes. Marco looked at her, then at the doctor, then back at the monitors displaying 2 heartbeats fighting to stay synchronized.
I'm not leaving her side, he said. Whatever happens, I'm staying right here.
The doctor nodded grimly. Then let's get started. As nurses prepared Lila for additional testing, Marco's mind drifted backward through the months that had led them here. Memory had a way of sharpening in crisis, and suddenly he could recall every detail of their beginning with perfect clarity. The diner had belonged to him. Not officially. The deed carried someone else's name, some distant cousin twice removed who needed legitimate income on paper. But everyone in that neighborhood understood who actually owned the property, who collected the real profits, who made the decisions that mattered. Lila had walked in on a Tuesday morning looking for work. She'd just moved to the city, carried 1 suitcase and determination that showed in the set of her shoulders. The manager had sent her to the back office where Marco happened to be reviewing numbers. I can work any shift, she'd said before he could speak. I'm reliable. I learn fast. And I don't ask questions about things that aren't my business. Co-signed about this is our business. That last part had made him smile. Most people either pretended ignorance or performed it badly. She simply acknowledged reality and moved past it. He'd hired her on the spot. For 3 months their interactions remained professional. She served breakfast, he ate it. She refilled his coffee. He thanked her. They existed in the same space without crossing the invisible line that separated her world from his. Then one morning she'd asked about the book he was reading. Such a small thing. Such an insignificant question. But it had opened a door neither of them knew how to close. They started talking. Really talking. Not the surface pleasantries customers and waitresses exchanged, but actual conversations about books and music and whether people were inherently good or just good at pretending. She challenged his cynicism. He complicated her optimism. They found middle ground in honesty. The attraction built slowly, like water wearing down stone. He noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated. She noticed how his voice softened when he spoke about his late mother. Small observations that accumulated into something undeniable. But Marco had been engaged to Sofia De Luca for 4 years by then. The engagement had been strategic from the start. Two powerful families joining forces, consolidating territory, strengthening alliances that made business sense even if romance didn't factor into the equation. Sofia understood that world. She'd been raised in it, trained for it, expected nothing different. They'd called it off 2 years before Lyle arrived. A mutual decision made over expensive wine in a restaurant neither of them enjoyed. The relationship had run its course. They'd remained friendly, or so Marco had thought. Sofia had moved to the West Coast, started her own ventures, sent Christmas cards that suggested she'd moved on. He hadn't realized she'd been waiting. With Lila, everything felt different. She didn't want his money or his name or the protection that came with being associated with him. She wanted conversation at 3 a.m. when the diner was empty. She wanted honesty about who he was and what he'd done. She wanted him, not the version of himself he performed for the world. 6 months after she'd started working there, he'd kissed her in the storage room during her break. She'd kissed him back, and that had been the beginning of everything. They'd kept it quiet at first, not secret but private, a distinction that mattered to both of them. He didn't parade her around or make claims on her publicly. She didn't ask for special treatment or expect his world to accommodate hers. Then she'd gotten pregnant. Marco remembered the afternoon she told him. They'd been in his apartment, sunlight streaming through the windows, and she'd been terrified he would react badly. Instead, he'd pulled her close and asked her to move in with him. "You don't have to do that," she'd said. "I want to," he'd replied. "I want this. I want you. I want our family." She'd cried against his shoulder, relief and joy tangled together. That's when Sofia had returned to the city. She'd heard through mutual connections, those gossip networks that existed in their world like underground rivers. A waitress, pregnant, living in Marco's apartment with round-the-clock security and a nursery being furnished with care that suggested permanence. Sofia had called first, friendly. Curious, could they meet for lunch? Marco had declined politely. She'd called again a week later. Less friendly, more insistent. She deserved closure, didn't she? They'd meant something to each other once. He'd agreed to coffee. 1 hour, neutral location. Sofia had spent 58 minutes explaining why Lila was wrong for him. Too young, too naive, too far outside their world to ever truly understand it. She'd spoken with concern that masked fury, advice that carried threat. "You're making a mistake," she'd said finally. "And mistakes in our world have consequences." Marco had walked out at the 59-minute mark. The threats had escalated after that. Nothing direct, nothing Marco could prove. But Lila started receiving strange calls, hang-ups at odd hours. Her car had been keyed twice in the secured parking garage. Someone had sent her flowers with a card that read, "Some women don't know when they're unwelcome." Marco had moved her into the estate for safety. Sofia had shown up uninvited yesterday afternoon, claiming she'd left jewelry in the guest suite from years ago. The staff had let her in. They remembered her, trusted her, didn't think to check with Marco first. She'd found Lila alone at the top of the stairs. And now here they were. The door opened, pulling Marco back to the present. The doctor entered with a tablet, his expression marginally less grave than before. "The latest ultrasound shows the baby's heart rate has stabilized," he announced. "Still irregular, but within acceptable parameters for now. We're going to hold off on emergency intervention." Lila exhaled, a sound that carried months of accumulated tension. "He's okay, for now, but you need complete bed rest. No stress, no excitement. We'll continue monitoring every hour." Marco felt something unclench in his chest, not relief. The danger remains too real for that, but hope. Fragile and tentative, but present. "Thank you," he said. The doctor nodded and left them alone again. Lila turned her head on the pillow to look at Marco, tears streaming down her face. "We're going to get through this," he told her. "All 3 of us." She smiled weakly. "Promise?" "Promise." Outside the window, afternoon faded toward evening. Inside the room, 2 heartbeats continued their synchronized rhythm on the monitors, fighting together to survive what violence had tried to destroy. Hours passed in that hospital room, marked by the steady beep of monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses checking vitals. Marco hadn't left Lila's side, hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. His hand remained clasped around hers, an anchor for them both. Night should have fallen by now, but the afternoon sun seemed suspended outside the window, as if time itself had agreed to slow down, to give them these moments before whatever came next. Lila had been quiet for the last 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling with an expression Marco couldn't quite read. Not pain, the medication handled most of that. Something deeper, something that made the silence between them feel heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Marco," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm here. I need to ask you something." She turned her head to look at him directly. "And I need you to be honest with me." His stomach tightened. "Anything. If something happens to me," she held up her free hand when he started to protest. "If something happens, I don't want him growing up wondering if you loved me." The words landed like a physical blow. Marco's throat closed around a response he couldn't form, couldn't shape into anything coherent. He tried to speak twice before managing actual words. "Nothing is going to happen to you. You don't know that." Her eyes held his with startling intensity for someone who'd nearly died hours ago. "The doctors don't know that. Nobody knows that. And I need him to understand that this was real, that we were real." Tears burned behind Marco's eyes, the first he'd allowed himself since carrying her bleeding body off that staircase. They spilled over before he could stop them, tracking hot paths down his face. "He'll know," Marco managed. "I'll make sure he knows." "Will he?" Lila's thumb stroked across his knuckles. "Or will he grow up hearing stories about the waitress his father got pregnant, the woman who wasn't from our world, who didn't belong, who died before they could make it official?" The truth in her words cut deeper than any blade. That's exactly how the story would be told in certain circles. How Sophia, and people like her, would frame it. A tragedy, yes, but ultimately a cautionary tale about crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. "What do you need from me?" Marco asked, leaning closer. "Tell me what you need and I'll give it to you." Lila smiled then, soft and sad and achingly beautiful despite the pallor of her skin, despite the bandages and the ivy lines and the hospital gown that swallowed her frame. "Marry me," she said, "even if it's just us." The world tilted sideways. Marco stared at her, certain he'd misheard, certain the exhaustion and fear had distorted her words into something his desperate heart wanted to hear. But she gazed back steadily, waiting, her question hanging in the air between them like something fragile and precious. "Lila, I know it's not romantic," she continued quickly. "I know this is a hospital room, and I look terrible, and it's not what anyone dreams about when they think about getting married. But I don't care about any of that. I need, yes," the word erupted from him before she could finish. "Yes, God, yes." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Really?" Marco brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles, her palm, her wrist. "I was going to ask you, after the baby came. I had a ring picked out. I was waiting for the right moment, and like an idiot, I thought I had time. Prize? You have a ring? Have. It's at the estate." He laughed, a broken sound that held no humour. "I was going to take you to the beach. Make some grand gesture, be the man you deserved instead of the one who let you get hurt. You didn't let anything happen." Lila squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "And I don't need a beach. I just need you." They sat with that truth for a moment, the simplicity of it settling over them like benediction. Outside their window, the world kept turning. Inside this room, two people who'd found each other against all odds chose each other again. "When?" Marco asked. "When do you want to do this?" "Tomorrow. Today. As soon as possible." Her voice carried urgency that went beyond eagerness. "I don't know how much time we have, and I don't want to waste it." Marco stood, still holding her hand, and turned toward the door. A nurse sat at the station just outside, monitoring their room along with 3 others. He caught her attention through the window. She entered moments later, concern creasing her forehead. "Is everything okay? We want to get married," Marco announced. "Here, as soon as it can be arranged." The nurse blinked, processing the request. Then her expression softened into something approaching joy. "Let me talk to the chaplain. We have a chapel on the 2nd floor. Give me 30 minutes." She disappeared with purpose, and Marco returned to Lila's side. "Is this crazy?" Lila asked. "Are we being crazy?" "Probably." Marco brushed hair back from her forehead. "But I don't care. If you want crazy, I'll give you crazy." The next hour moved in fragments. The nurse returned with the chaplain, a gentle-faced woman in her 60s who asked no questions beyond confirming they were both of sound mind and willing. A social worker appeared with paperwork. Another nurse offered to help Lila prepare to make her as comfortable as possible for the ceremony. "We'll make this beautiful," the nurse promised. You deserve beautiful. Have you ever made a decision in crisis that felt both reckless and absolutely right? Have you ever loved someone so fiercely that waiting one more day felt impossible? That's the space Marco and Lila occupied, suspended between tragedy and hope, choosing love in the face of uncertainty. If you've ever believed that moments matter more than perfect timing, hit that like button. Drop a comment about whether you'd make the same choice in their position, and subscribe, because what happens in that chapel will break your heart and rebuild it in the same breath. They were preparing to move Leela when her face suddenly drained of what little colour it had regained. Her hand went to her stomach, fingers pressing inward as if trying to hold something in place. Lila? Marco leaned forward, alarm flooding his system. It hurts, she gasped. Something's wrong. The monitors erupted into urgent beeping. The nurse rushed to check the readings, her professional calm cracking at the edges. Get the doctor, she barked at her colleague. Now! The doctor arrived within 90 seconds, eyes scanning the monitors before moving to examine Lila. His hands moved across her abdomen with practiced care, but Marco saw the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth. The bleeding has increased, the doctor said quietly. We need to stabilize her before any movement. The wedding, Lila started, can wait until you're stable? No, she grabbed the doctor's sleeve with surprising force. It can't wait. Please, I need this. I need to marry him before. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The doctor looked at Marco, then at Leela, then at the monitors still screaming their warnings. His jaw worked as he calculated risks, weighed medical protocol against human need. Against my better judgment, he said finally. But we do this in the chapel with full medical support. Any sign of deterioration and we stop immediately. Marco nodded, not trusting his voice. Then let's get you married, the doctor said. They began the careful process of moving her, monitors and IV poles following like a mechanical processional. Marco walked beside the bed, his hand never leaving hers, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was happening, despite everything, despite the odds. They were going to get married. The chapel occupied a quiet corner of the hospital's second floor, a space designed for moments when medicine alone couldn't provide what people needed. Afternoon sunlight poured through stained glass windows, casting patterns of blue and gold across simple wooden pews. The room held perhaps 20 seats, but only one mattered today. They wheeled Lila's bed to the front, positioning it carefully near the altar. Medical equipment followed, monitors continuing their persistent beeping, IV stands forming a metallic forest around her. The doctor stood nearby, arms crossed, ready to intervene if her body gave any indication this was too much. The chaplain waited at the front, her silver hair catching the coloured light. She wore simple vestments and carried a worn Bible, and when she looked at Lila, her expression held the gentle understanding of someone who'd witnessed every variation of human joy and sorrow. Are you ready? She asked softly. Lila nodded, then looked at Marco. Will you carry me? The request landed in his chest with the weight of everything unsaid between them. She could make this journey on the bed, surrounded by nurses and equipment and safety. But she was asking for something more, to walk down an aisle the way brides were meant to, even if her legs couldn't hold her. Always, he said. The nurse who'd helped arrange everything had found a white sheet, freshly laundered and soft. She draped it over Lila's shoulders like a shawl, arranging the fabric to hide the worst of the bandages and IV lines. It wasn't a wedding dress. It would never be mistaken for one, but in the chapel light, with Leela's dark hair spilling over the white cotton, she looked radiant. Marco slid his arms beneath her, one supporting her shoulders, the other under her knees. She weighed almost nothing. Blood loss and trauma had hollowed her out, made her feel fragile as bird bones. He lifted her carefully, terrified of causing pain, of disturbing injuries that were barely holding together. I've got you, he murmured. I know. She rested her head against his shoulder, and he began the walk. There was no music, no processional march, just the sound of his footsteps on tile and the steady rhythm of the heart monitor tracking both their pulses. The nurse fell in step behind them, a witness to this moment, and the chaplain waited at the front with infinite patience. Marco looked down at the woman in his arms. Blood from the fall still stained his white shirt in rust-coloured patches across the front and sleeves. He'd refused to change. Some part of him needing to carry the evidence of what had happened, of how close he'd come to losing her before they had this chance. They reached the front. He wanted to set her down gently in a chair, to give her stability for the ceremony, but her fingers tightened in his shirt, holding on, and he understood. She wanted to be held, wanted to feel safe in his arms for these vows, even if safety was an illusion they were both performing. So he stood there, cradling her, while the chaplain opened her Bible. Dearly beloved, she began, her voice soft and reverent. "We are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. What we witness today is not bound by tradition or expectation, but by love that refuses to wait for perfect conditions." The words washed over them. Marco felt Lila's breath against his neck, felt the tremor in her body that spoke of pain she was trying to hide. Her hand found his face, palm cool against his jaw, fingers tracing the stubble he hadn't bothered shaving. "Do you, Marco Valenti, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" His voice broke on the first word. "I do." The chaplain turned to Lila. "And do you, Lila Monroe, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Lila's response came stronger than Marco expected, clear and certain despite everything. "I do. Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The chaplain smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "You may kiss your bride." Marco shifted his hold on Lila, adjusting her weight so he could lean down without dropping her. Their lips met softly, a kiss that tasted of salt and medicine and desperate hope. Her hand slid to the back of his neck, pulling him closer for just a moment longer, and when they finally parted, her eyes were bright with tears. "I love you," she whispered. The words meant only for him. "I love you more than this world," he replied, meaning it with every fibre of his being. More than power, more than legacy, more than the empire he'd built or the reputation he'd cultivated. She was the centre of everything now. Lila smiled then, truly smiled, and for a heartbeat the pain left her face entirely. She looked young and happy, and completely certain that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The sunlight caught in her hair turned the white sheet luminous, and Marco committed every detail to memory because some moments demanded to be remembered perfectly. The nurse who'd witnessed their vows stepped forward with paperwork already prepared. Marco signed first, his signature steady despite the trembling in his hands. Then he held the clipboard for Lila, supporting her while she added her name beside his in shaky script that barely resembled her usual handwriting. Lila Monroe became Lila Valenti in that moment, ink making permanent what their hearts had already decided. "Congratulations," the chaplain said warmly. "I've married hundreds of couples in this chapel, but I don't think I've ever witnessed love quite like this." Marco nodded his thanks, words beyond him right now. He felt Lila's weight shift slightly in his arms, felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with emotion. "Lila?" Her hand pressed against her chest, fingers splayed wide as if trying to hold something inside. "Just give me a second." But seconds weren't cooperating. Her breathing grew shallow, rapid, each inhale harder one than the last. The white sheet rose and fell with increasing urgency, and behind them the heart monitor's steady beep began to waver. The doctor moved immediately, checking her pulse, her pupils, the monitors that were starting to alarm. "Mrs. Valenti, can you hear me?" "Yes," Lila managed, though her voice had gone thin and distant. "I need you to take slow breaths, in through your nose, out through your mouth." She tried. Marco watched her try, but her body wasn't listening anymore, some switch inside her flipping from function to failure. Her eyes found his, wide and frightened, and he saw the question there that she didn't have breath to ask. "Is this it? Is this all we get?" "Look at me," Marco commanded gently, his own voice remarkably steady for a man watching his wife slip away minutes after marrying her. "Stay with me. You're Lila Valenti now. You don't get to leave." She smiled faintly at that, at the absurdity of him giving orders to biology and trauma. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet for anyone but him to hear. "Best day of my life." Then her eyes closed. The monitors screamed, and the chapel filled with the controlled chaos of medical professionals fighting to keep death from claiming what love had just joined together. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, hands moving across equipment, voices calling out numbers that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. Marco refused to put Lila down, refused to step back, refused to do anything except hold his wife while doctors fought for her life. After 90 seconds that felt like hours, her eyes fluttered open. The doctor exhaled relief. That was a severe drop in blood pressure. "We're stabilizing her now, but she needs to get back to her room immediately." "Wait." Lila's voice emerged, barely audible. "Just one more minute." The doctor looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. He nodded tersely and stepped back, giving them space while remaining close enough to intervene. Marco carried her to the front pew and finally, carefully, lowered himself onto the wooden seat with Lila still cradled in his arms. She settled against his chest, the white sheet draped across her like a shroud, and when she looked up at him, her expression held profound peace. "We did it," she whispered. "We did." Marco's thumb traced her cheekbone, memorizing the curve of her face. "You're my wife, and you're my husband." She smiled at the word, testing it, finding it fit perfectly despite how they'd arrived here. "I need to tell you something. Anything." Her fingers found his collar curling into the blood-stained fabric with surprising strength. "If I don't make it, you're going to make it. Marco." She said his name with gentle firmness. "Listen to me. If I don't make it, I need you to promise me something." His throat closed, but he nodded. "Don't let this destroy you." Her eyes held his with startling clarity. "Don't become the kind of man who stops living because he lost someone. Our son needs a father who remembers how to be happy. I don't know if I can be happy without you." "You can. You will." She touched his face, her cool palm against his jaw. "Love isn't about holding on so tight that when it ends you suffocate. It's about being grateful you had it at all." The wisdom in her words belied her 24 years. Marco wondered when she'd become so certain about life, about loss, about the nature of grief he hadn't even begun to process yet. "How are you so calm?" he asked. "Because I got what I wanted." Her smile turned radiant despite her pallor. "I got to marry you. I got to tell our son, when he asks someday, that yes, his father loved me enough to make it official, that we were real, that we mattered." Tears tracked down Marco's face unchecked. "You matter more than anything." "Then prove it." Her grip tightened on his collar. "Prove it by living well, by raising him with kindness instead of the violence you were raised in, by teaching him that power means nothing if you use it to hurt people who can't fight back." She was talking about Sophia without saying her name, about the cycle of cruelty that defined their world, about the choice he had now to perpetuate it or break it. "I promise," he said, and meant it. Lila's breathing had steadied slightly, each inhale still laboured but more controlled than moments ago. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, a metronome counting down seconds neither of them could see. "Tell me about the ring," she said suddenly. "The one you picked out." Marco laughed despite everything, a sound wet with tears. "Simple. White gold band with a small diamond. Nothing ostentatious. You would have hated anything flashy. I would have loved it because you chose it. I'll bring it to you, soon as we're back in your room." She nodded, but they both knew the ring didn't matter now. The marriage certificate did, the vows did. The fact that she would die with his last name instead of dying as someone he'd simply loved without making permanent. "I'm tired," Lila admitted after a moment. "Is that okay? Can I close my eyes for a minute?" "Of course." Marco adjusted his hold, making her more comfortable. "Rest. I've got you." "You always say that, because it's always true." Her eyes drifted shut, and for several heartbeats Marco allowed himself to believe this was just sleep, just exhaustion from the ceremony and the trauma and the medication wearing thin. Her chest rose and fell beneath the white sheet. Her hand remained curled in his collar. She looked peaceful. Then the rhythm changed. The monitor's steady beep began to slow. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just a gradual stretching of space between each electronic pulse, like a clock winding down. The doctor noticed immediately. He moved closer, checking readings with growing concern etched across his features. "Mrs. Valenti?" He touched her shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" No response. Marco's heart hammered against his ribs. "Lila, baby, wake up." Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her fingers loosened their grip on his collar by degrees, the strength seeping out of her like water through cupped hands. "Do something," Marco demanded, looking at the doctor. "We're losing her." The doctor's voice carried the weight of inevitable defeat. "The internal bleeding has accelerated. There's nothing more we can do here." "Then take her to surgery. Do whatever you need to, Mr. Rolls." "Valenti." The doctor's hand landed on his shoulder. "Even if we could get her to an operating room in time, she's lost too much blood. Her body is shutting down." "I'm sorry." The words hit like bullets. Marco looked down at his wife, and saw the truth written in the pallor of her skin, in the blue tinge creeping into her lips, in the way her breath came shallow and infrequent. "Please," he whispered against her hair. "Please don't leave me." Her hand moved one last time, fingers tightening around his collar with the faintest pressure. Her lips parted, and he leaned close to hear the words that emerged barely louder than breath. "Love him for both of us." Then her hand went still. The monitor's beep continued its steady rhythm. Once, twice, 3 more times. Then silence. The flatline scream filled the chapel, a single sustained note that announced the end of everything. Medical staff moved in choreographed response, but their movements carried the mechanical quality of protocol rather than hope. Marco sat frozen, his wife's body growing cooler in his arms, the white sheet now her burial shroud instead of her wedding dress. The sunlight still streamed through stained glass. The chaplain still stood nearby with tears on her cheeks. The world continued exactly as it had moments before. But Leila Valenti was gone. She'd lived long enough to become his wife, and died before she could be anything else. Marco didn't scream. The sound that came from him existed beyond language, beyond anything human vocal cords should produce. It was grief made audible, love collapsing inward, the noise a soul makes when it breaks cleanly in half. He pulled Leila closer, burying his face against her neck where her pulse should have been, where warmth should have radiated, where life should have continued but didn't. The white sheet tangled between them, and somewhere distant he registered that her body was already cooling. The biology waited for no one, not even grief. The medical staff stepped back. They'd seen death before. This was a hospital. Death lived here as permanently as the concrete foundation. But this particular configuration of loss seemed to demand privacy. The doctor quietly ushered the nurse toward the door. The chaplain bowed her head in silent prayer. They gave Marco space to hold his wife without audience, without intervention. Time fractured in the chapel. Minutes could have passed. Hours. The sunlight continued its slow progression across stained glass windows, painting different patterns on the floor, but Marco existed outside that measurement. He lived in a moment suspended between the last time Leila breathed and the first moment he would have to acknowledge she never would again. He talked to her, whispered promises against her hair, apologies for every time he'd been late, confessions of how deeply he'd loved her from that very first morning she'd spilled coffee on his expensive suit. His tears soaked into the white sheet, darkening the fabric in patches that spread like watercolor. "I'm sorry," he said over and over. "I'm so sorry." Eventually, he didn't know when. The chaplain approached with careful steps. "Mr. Valenti," she said gently, "I know this is impossible, but we need to let the medical staff care for her now." Marco's arms tightened reflexively. "No. She needs to be taken care of properly, with dignity. You want that for her, don't you?" He did. Of course he did. But wanting something and being able to release the woman he loved into the clinical machinery of death were entirely separate capabilities. The chaplain waited. Finally, after what might have been 10 minutes or 30, Marco nodded, his arms loosened by degrees, muscles protesting the movement after holding the same position for so long. 2 orderlies entered with a gurney, their movements respectful and unhurried. They lifted Leila from his lap with practiced gentleness, laying her on the white surface, covering her with a clean sheet that replaced the makeshift wedding dress. Marco watched them wheel her away, watched the chapel doors close behind her, watched his wife disappear from view. He sat alone on the pew. The chaplain had gone. The medical equipment had been removed. Only Marco remained in the empty space, staring at nothing, feeling the absence of weight in his arms like phantom pain. When he finally stood, his legs nearly gave out. He braced himself against the pew, waited for equilibrium to return, then walked toward the exit on unsteady feet. The hospital corridor assaulted him with normalcy. Nurses moved between rooms. An elderly man shuffled past with a walker. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried. Life continued with complete indifference to the fact that his had just ended. Marco walked past all of it through automatic doors, out into afternoon sunlight that felt obscene in its brightness. The world should have been dark, should have been raining, should have reflected the devastation he carried. Instead, the sky stretched cloudless and blue above him. His driver waited in the circular drive, the black sedan idling with tinted windows that offered privacy Marco no longer cared about. The man's face registered shock at Marco's appearance. The blood, the tears, the vacant expression of someone who'd survived catastrophe only to find survival meant nothing. "Take me home," Marco said, his voice flat. They drove in silence. The estate felt cavernous when he entered. Staff materialized with concern and questions he couldn't answer. He climbed the stairs, those same marble steps where Leila had fallen, and locked himself in his bedroom. News reached him in fragments over the following days. Sophia had been arrested at the hospital. Assault charges initially, upgraded to manslaughter when Leila died. She'd confessed immediately, offered no defense, seemed almost relieved to face consequences. The trial would be brief, the outcome certain. Marco felt nothing about it. Revenge didn't resurrect the dead. Justice didn't fill the space Leila had occupied. Sophia's imprisonment changed nothing that mattered. The funeral happened on a Thursday. Marco had insisted on simplicity, a small service, white roses because Lila had loved them. The chaplain from the hospital spoke briefly about love that transcended circumstance. 20 people attended, mostly staff who'd known Lila from the diner, a few neighbours from her old apartment building, people whose lives she'd touched with small kindnesses Marco was only now learning about. They buried her in a cemetery overlooking the ocean. The headstone read simply, Lila Valenti, beloved wife. Marco stood at the graveside long after everyone else departed, staring at the fresh earth that covered the woman who'd promised to love him for better or worse, and gotten only worse. I won't do this again, he said to the headstone. You were it for me. The vow felt necessary, final. He would never remarry, never love another woman, never risk this particular configuration of agony. Lila had been his chance at something real, and violence had stolen it before they'd barely begun. But her words stayed with him. Her final instructions about raising their son with kindness, about breaking the cycle, about proving love by living well instead of dying slowly from grief. He didn't know if he could honour that. Didn't know if transformation was possible for a man like him. Then 3 days after the funeral, the doctor called. Marco almost didn't answer. Medical professionals held nothing for him now except reminders of failure, but something made him pick up, made him listen to the voice on the other end explain something impossible. Mr. Valenti, I wanted to inform you personally about the autopsy findings. There was something we discovered about the pregnancy. Marco's hand tightened around the phone. What about it? During the fall and subsequent trauma, Mrs. Valenti went into premature. The process had begun before she died, though she likely didn't realize it due to her other injuries. I don't understand. The doctor paused, and in that pause Marco heard his entire future rewrite itself. Your son was born during emergency procedures after your wife passed. He's premature, critically so, but he's alive. He's in our neonatal intensive care unit, and Mr. Valenti, he's fighting. The phone nearly slipped from Marco's hand. He's alive? Yes. Would you like to meet him? 6 weeks later, Marco stood at Lila's grave under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The cemetery sprawled across rolling hills on the outskirts of the city. Rows of headstones marking lives lived and lost, stories concluded. Oak trees provided shade in strategic locations, and in the distance the ocean murmured its eternal rhythm against the shore. It was peaceful here, the kind of place Lila would have chosen if she'd had time to choose anything. Marco came every Tuesday and Thursday, always in the afternoon when sunlight softened the edges of grief enough to make it bearable. He carried fresh white roses, her favourite, and spent an hour talking to marble and earth as if conversation could bridge the gap between living and dead. Today he brought someone else. The infant carrier rested at his feet, secured and protected from the autumn breeze. Inside, his son slept fitfully, tiny chest rising and falling with the determined breathing of someone who'd fought death and won. 3 pounds at birth, tubes and wires and terrifying fragility, but alive. The doctors had called him a miracle. Marco called him Lila's final gift. I brought him to meet you, Marco said quietly, addressing the headstone. He's still small, but he's getting stronger every day. He has your eyes. Did you know that? I didn't expect it this early, but they're the same shade of brown, same shape. When he looks at me, I see you. The baby stirred at the sound of his father's voice, but didn't wake. Marco crouched beside the carrier, adjusting the blanket with the careful movements of someone still learning how to be gentle. I've been thinking about what you said, about not letting this destroy me, about raising him with kindness. He stood, hands sliding into his pockets. It's harder than you made it sound. The weeks since her death had transformed him in ways he was still discovering. Grief had carved out spaces inside him he hadn't known existed, hollow places that filled with rage and sorrow and questions without answers. But beneath that, something else had taken root. Purpose. Lila had loved him not despite who he was, but because she believed he could become someone better. She'd seen past the violence and the power to the man underneath, who wanted something real, something clean, something that mattered beyond territory and respect and fear. She died believing in that version of him. The least he could do was try to become it. I made some changes, Marco continued, at the organisation. New rules about how we handled disputes. No more civilian casualties accepted as collateral damage. No more using fear as the primary tool. Some of the older members think I've gone soft. He smiled without humour. Maybe I have. But I keep thinking about you at the top of those stairs. About how easily violence escalates when we accept it as normal. Sophia didn't wake up that morning planning murder. She just existed in a world where pushing someone seemed like a reasonable response to jealousy. That realization had cost him sleep. the understanding that he'd built the very system that made Lila's death possible. Not directly, Sophia owned her choices, but the culture of solving problems through force, of treating people as obstacles rather than humans with their own stories that came directly from how he'd chosen to lead. "So I'm changing it," he said, "for him." Marco glanced down at his son. The baby had opened his eyes, staring up at nothing with that unfocused gaze newborns possessed. Small fists waved at the air, and Marco reached down to offer a finger that was immediately grasped with surprising strength. Love didn't erase the past, didn't resurrect the dead or undo the harm that had been done, but it could inform the future. It could transform a man who'd built his life on dominance into a father who understood that real power came from protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. That was Lila's legacy. Not the tragedy of her death, but the possibility she'd seen in him, the better man she'd believed existed beneath the armor he'd constructed. "I wish you were here to see this," Marco said, his voice cracking slightly. "I wish you could watch him grow up, could teach him all the things I don't know how to teach. How to be kind, how to find joy in small things, how to love without reservation." But she wasn't here, would never be here, and Marco had to learn to live in the space between what should have been and what actually was. The ocean wind picked up, rustling through oak leaves, carrying the salt smell of water across the cemetery. Marco stood there letting it wash over him, holding his son's tiny hand, anchored to both past and future simultaneously.
"I keep my promises," he told the headstone. "You ask me to live well."
"To raise him right, to prove that you mattered by how I move forward. So that's what I'm doing." It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. He thought about the morning at the diner when this all started. Simple breakfast order, spilled coffee, a woman who looked at him and saw just a man instead of a monster. How could either of them have known where that moment would lead? The love, the loss, the brief marriage and briefer widowhood. Sometimes the most important chapters of our lives are the shortest ones. Have you ever lost someone who changed everything? Have you ever had to figure out how to honor a person by becoming better than you were when they knew you? That's the journey Marco walks now, not toward happiness, because happiness feels like betrayal, but toward meaning, toward making her sacrifice count for something more than tragedy. If this story reminded you that love matters even when it ends too soon, hit that like button. Drop a comment about whether people can truly change, or if we're all just performing versions of ourselves until crisis forces truth to the surface. And subscribe, because stories like this, the ones that break your heart and rebuild it differently, those are the ones worth remembering. Marco picked up the infant carrier, preparing to leave. But before turning away, he placed his palm flat against the cool marble of Lila's headstone. His wedding ring caught the afternoon light, gold band gleaming with simple permanence. "I love you," he said. "I'll always love you." The words felt inadequate. Love was supposed to be strong enough to overcome anything, but it hadn't overcome gravity or internal bleeding or the violence of a jealous woman's hands. It hadn't saved Lila or given them the years they should have had, but it had given them something. A marriage that lasted minutes. A son who would grow up knowing his mother loved his father enough to spend her last breaths making that official. A man transformed by loss into someone capable of building something better than what came before. Marco looked down at the headstone one final time, reading the words carved there. Lila Valenti, beloved wife. She'd wanted their son to know the love was real, wanted proof that she mattered, that they mattered, that their story was more than a tragic footnote in someone else's life. Mission accomplished. Marco had carried her to the altar just as the title promised, had married her in a hospital chapel with blood still staining his clothes, had held her as she died with his last name, instead of dying as someone he'd simply loved without making permanent. The tragedy was complete, the romance fulfilled, and in the carrier at his feet, a 3-pound baby boy slept peacefully, completely unaware that he represented both the worst day of his father's life and the only reason that father chose to keep living. Marco turned from the grave and walked back toward his car, carrying his son toward whatever future they could build from the ruins of the one that should have been. The afternoon sun warmed his shoulders. Lila would have liked that. The warmth, the light, the simple fact that beauty still existed even after loss. Behind him, white roses decorated marble. Ahead, a child who needed raising waited. And Marco Valenti, the man who'd lost everything, walked forward carrying the only thing that mattered. "Before I go, I just want to say this channel exists because I truly love creating these stories for you. Lately, things have been a bit tough financially for me and my family. If you're in a position to support the channel, no matter how small, it genuinely means the world to me. Your support helps me keep making the stories you're here for. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.